morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from today. Do you see some Europeans in the room? So appreciate, as always, you guys spending some time with us in the early part of the evening. I'm joined today by Brian Bosse, CEO of the freshly named Cupani Metals. How are you today, Brian?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Romeo, for setting this up.
Awesome. So let you know in the room, here's how today's going to work. Brian's going to run us through a presentation introducing Cupani Metals, and then I'm going to run through a few questions that I have for him based on that presentation. After that, I will say this is an interactive event, so please do feel free to ask any question you've got for Brian at any time during the event today using the chat button on the bottom right of your screen. While he's presenting, I'll shoot a message in there so it's really clear where you can type it in. And if for whatever reason we don't get to your question today, ran out of time or it felt off topic, etc., I'm going to make sure the Cupani team gets it and they'll get back to you as soon as possible via phone or email, depending on what you entered in your registration details. I'll also say that today's event is being recorded and will be available for replay late this afternoon Eastern time on both 6.com and also 6's YouTube channel. That's enough out of me. I'll throw it to Brian to start today's presentation.
Oh, thanks again. So I hope what everyone can see up on the screen is, well, the new company logo, Cupani. And I'll just, before I start the slide deck, I'll jump in very briefly to how we came to Cupani. Cu is the elemental symbol for copper, Ni for nickel, and we're a copper nickel, I'll say project, but there's a historical tonnage, so copper nickel discovery in northern Quebec in Canada. Now the other metals we have are platinum, palladium, and to our joy, we discovered a little bit of gold most recently in 2024. So that's where the PA comes from. So Cu, PA, Ni, Cupani, one of our directors and my business partner, Douglas McCory, he loves it because it sounds like an Italian motorcycle company, like Ducati. I love it because, you know, I've been a professional investor for a long time now, and one of the best managed companies in the resource space that I've ever owned shares of, and I've owned these shares for 20 years, is a company much, much larger than ours, also based in Quebec, called Agnico Eagle. And so by using 6 letters that each reference what's in the mine, we're kind of paying an homage to the team that named Agnico, because their name, AG, silver, Ni, nickel, and CO for cobalt, that's where they got their name from. So we are Cupani Metals Corp. For the prior 5 years, we were collecting and consolidating the claims I'm going to show you. And while we were doing that, we were doing distressed lending. So we were a finance company, same ownership, same management team. But because we were finance, we were using a name called Capital Light, which was a joke on the fact that when I started all this, the company had no capital. So let me jump into the deck. I'll start with, as you've already heard, we have a new name. The name changed last month. Cupani Metals Corporation. The website is being built up right now, and we have a new ticker to go with it. We're currently listed in the Canadian Securities Exchange, and the ticker is CUPA. So I've got a cup of tea right here. CUPA. As always, there's lots of legals. I'm going to be talking about the future. No one knows the future. And that's what this disclaimer sheet is showing. I've used the agenda for this presentation, and I'll try and keep it down to about 20, 25 minutes. I've used the agenda that I also used for the AGM that we gave to shareholders on December 11th. That was a much longer presentation than this one's going to be. But I know there are people who are going to be watching both. We have a very dedicated shareholder base. So I want to use the same agenda items and then just tell you I've deleted items out of the deck in order to make this one run shorter. Okay. There's our cool logo again. And let's just jump in. So the first question always is, where is it? And so we're in Canada. The lower inset map here shows you essentially what part of Canada we're talking about, Quebec. And so there's the St. Lawrence River. Over here is the Hudson Bay. Over here is the Atlantic Ocean. And just down here is the United States. And our star shows where we are right on the, just above the border between Labrador, which is part of Newfoundland, and the province of Quebec. this larger map shows the existing infrastructure in the area. So our claims are just to the east-northeast of Schefferville. Schefferville is the northern terminus for an existing rail line. That rail line has been running since the 1950s. It was built by the Iron Ore Company of Canada. It's essentially why Schefferville is where it is. The Iron Ore Company of Canada built open pit mines in the 1940s and the 1950s. And that is why the line is there. The line is still running. Tata Steel now owns those operations. So we are 65 kilometers east-northeast of that railhead. And much of that 65 kilometers is actually across a shallow lake called Anticline. We'll get into that later. The point to make is that infrastructure already exists to get a product to market. We're not talking about finding a resource that's 1,000 miles from any route to market, okay? This slide, and this is the one that really set management on its ear in May of 2024. This slide is not one of ours. We've taken this from a government report published in 2015. And this is coordinated work between the Quebec government, the federal government of Canada, and the government of Newfoundland Labrador. And they set out teams over several years to collect lake bed and riverbed sediment samples. And then they brought all those samples back to the lab and they measured them for metals content. And then they built this heat map, red being the hotspots, for where there are higher metals content, and then blue is where there's less or none metals content in the sediments of the lakes and the rivers. And we already owned claims inside this blotch, this spot of red, the largest spot you can see there. But when we found this, we realized that we should own everything. And so we did. We staked up. Now we're over 500 kilometers squared of claims. We own them all outright. A couple of them have a small royalty that you can buy back, so we're not particularly worried about that. And a lot of these claims are things that used to be owned by giant companies like Anglo-American. And then as commodity prices go up and down, they would drop them. And we've now consolidated the entire thing. Let me go to the next slide. So this slide is where we have taken the data from that government report. We took it into comma separated values so we could bring it into Excel. And we put it into our geology mapping software. And then we built lines of equivalence or isobars. And we asked the computer to show us everything where the government geologists have found greater than 200 parts per million copper in the lake bed sediments. We've ignored nickel, but there's nickel there as well for this purpose. And the entire area we've staked up. We call it the Blue Lake Project Claims Block. There's a diagonal red box almost in the center of the screen there. And that is a hot spot, not the hottest spot, but it is a hot spot for copper nickel in the lake beds. And that is also where, identified in the 1980s, but basically abandoned ever since until we scooped it up, there are 5 million tons of copper, nickel, platinum, palladium in a series of pods near surface. There was also an adit driven into the deposit in the 1980s. And the copper, to express everything in copper, the copper equivalence is 2.2%. So, in the 1980s, 2.2 was pretty good. Now it's fantastic. And what our company is based on is starting from what's inside that box and then working eventually to cover everything that's inside the greater than 200 parts per million isobars. What can we find? And, if my prayers are answered, we're going to find the next Raglan mine. And Raglan is a mine that's 600 kilometers or 800 kilometers northwest of us. It's been operating since 1990. It's owned by Glencore. It's in the same geological event that we are, something called the Labrador Trough. And we've got years of work ahead of us, but that's what we're hoping to find. Okay. There's some points here on the slide that I'll just touch on for a second. I talked about that rectangular box. It's not the hottest spot. We didn't know it at the time, but the hottest spot, and I'll put my cursor over it if I can, is right here. And we sent a field crew there, first time that a field crew had ever gone there. We sent a field crew there in September of 2024 to follow up on some electromagnetic occurrences that had been mapped almost 13 years earlier by Anglo American. And we found what we now call Cancun, the Cancun zone. And that Cancun zone so far at surface is 9 kilometers long of copper nickel. Now the rock is weathered at surface. That's something we're going to do in 2025 is check to see what's underneath the weathered rock. And, we've picked up just from sampling there, bedrock sampling anywhere between 0.2 and 1%. Copper equivalent. It's 9 kilometers long. It's huge. So we really want to know what the grade is going to be below surface. We want to know how deep this goes, how wide it becomes. It's 40 feet wide at surface. We've got photos for that. You'll see that later on. In this map, and this is it's kind of complicated to look at compared to the other ones. All I want you to take away from here is that we have an immense area. We break it up into 5 zones. The zones are labeled alphabetically. So we have a zone that begins with the letter A, a zone that begins with the letter B, the letter C zone, the letter D, the letter E. I don't know if we'll ever add another zone because, like I said, we already have a huge amount. If we did, it would have to begin with F. And we do that because we know that exploration is complicated. Not all the shareholders want to get into figuring out exactly what is where or how to keep them straight in your mind. So that's why we're using alphabetics. So A for Anticline. There's an Anticline lake out there. We chose that. Blue Lake. There's a Blue Lake. There's a lake named Blue. That's where the historical deposits are. Cancun zone. You can see the green stars. Those are all the showings we found in 2024. The Doublet zone, there's a lake called Doublet, and then the extensions, we're calling that because the geological event extends off towards in the direction of Raglan, and that's a good name for it for now. Okay. It's definitely an ambitious land package for a company of our size. Our market cap today is, 20 million Canadian, and this is a huge bite. But we've got an excellent team, and you'll learn more about that. And we're well capitalized. You'll learn more about that. The next slide, and I don't want to get too deep into geology. I'm trying to put this in a way that almost everyone can understand it. There are red dots on this slide that represent existing copper nickel mines. And not only are they existing copper nickel mines, but most of them have been in operation for over 100 years or nearly 100 years, or they're going to continue in operation for the foreseeable future, well beyond what they were originally designed for. How did that happen? How is it that somebody opened a mine in the case of Raglan with 30 million tons of reserve, 18 million tons of reserve, and they still have reserve greater than that amount, and they've been operating for 34 years? Well, the answer is depth. And this is where this map becomes relevant. The red dots on the map all show that mines can be built and operate for a very long time if they're situated at a collision zone where parts of what are now North America collided to become the continent that we recognize. So there's Thompson, Manitoba, Sudbury, Duluth, Minnesota, just below that, the Eagle Mine. Then there's, of course, Raglan and Voisey's Bay, all of which are at collision zones. And the purple X, that's where we are. We are also at a collision zone. In fact, it's the same collision zone, geologically speaking, as the Raglan mine and the Thompson mine. So that's why we're not only excited that we're going to find something that's going to be a great reward for us, but that whenever a mine does get built, we're expecting it to run a very, very long time on the assumption that as you go deeper, you're continually finding something. Okay. This is my last slide about history. This is a slide regarding the Raglan mine that I've mentioned already a couple times. I've mentioned it because it's kind of our, what could this be? You know, if you need a mental model to think about what we're looking for the next Raglan mine. And so across the bottom of this chart, labeled as the number of years, on the left-hand side, it's hard to read, it starts in 1957. And on the right-hand side, it goes all the way to 2019. And the blue background is how many millions of tons of resource are associated with the mine. And you can see in 1957, the number is 0, and then it grows to about 2. And then in the 1960s, it rises up from 2 to about 10. And then from the early 1960s until 1990, basically 1993, nothing really happened, 10 million. And then that number starts to jump, and it continues to go up today. The mine opened in 1990 with, I think, 18 at the time, resource and reserve. And today it's still operating. It's been operating, I think, 1.5 million tons a year for 30 years, should have chewed up 50 million tons, way more than the 18 it started with. And yet they're finding material faster than they can mine it. And that's what this graph shows. So, you know, this is a long way ahead from where we are, but I want to show prospective shareholders that Douglas and I as a management team are thinking in decades. We're doing the right things so that we can deliver this, if it's there, for shareholders. And we're well aware of what it could become. Okay. Exploration is always hard. The advantage that we have in exploration is that there are 4 things that characterize the rock we're looking for. It's magnetic. It conducts electricity. There's a high and low conductor. We'll get to that later. And it's heavier than the surrounding rock. And so far, every time there's a historical tonnage to be found, let's say it that way. The historical tonnage, the 5 million tons, there's always been something on surface as a clue, right? There's always weathered rock on top of better rock underneath. And so when we conduct our exploration, we keep these 4 things in mind. And then later on in 2025, when we start drilling all of these targets, this will be helping us to decide where to drill. Okay. A, B, C, D, E, F. So 5 zones. We're going to talk now about the Blue Lake zone. This is the most developed zone. This is the zone where the historical tonnage is. And this is the first zone that we had claims in, and we consolidated everything else around. Okay. This is an image taken from helicopter of a hole into the side of a hill, and the hole is essentially the start of a mine. It was made in the 1987. Heavy equipment was brought in to do all that. They brought it in over an ice road from the town of Shefferville. They pulled out, if memory serves, I think it's about 100 tons of material. You can see it piled there. I've been there. There are sticks on each pile describing where in this adit, this beginning mine, where in this adit it came from. And then we have mapping, which shows us the grade that is assigned to each one. The material was never processed and sold. It's just sitting there outside. We have gone in our first main reconnaissance, which happened in May of 2024, to go look around and confirm that everything that we read in the historical record about this is accurate. It is. In fact, we might find that they were more conservative than they needed to be with their numbers. There's a lot of good-looking rock to be found there, and that's how we have, for example, we know the gravity. We know that this rock is heavier than the rocks around it because we've been able to measure the relative gravity of each. And there are spots on here where you can pick up a piece of rock. When we sent it to the lab, and it's 7% copper. So there's a tantalizing possibility that things get even better than the historical record, and the historical record is really good already for grade. Okay. Why did it stop? So like I said, 1987, I'm just gonna wet my whistle here. 1987, this hole was made, the bulk sample was done, and that company was focused on the platinum and the palladium that was going to be mined, from what they were going to build. And that was clear because of what's in their name. Their company was called LaFosse Platinum Group. In the 1980s, if you know your history, gold peaked at what was then $850 an ounce in 1980, which was in the middle and continuing throughout the rest of the decade of an exploration boom for precious metals. And this was part of that. Today, platinum and palladium prices, not bad. But copper nickel, I think, is where you're going to have a great response, especially for batteries and critical minerals and all the things we're going to need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Here's where it gets exciting. So this map is the same thing that the same region, the Blue Lake Zone, and I'll just use my cursor to try and show where that adit you were looking at a second ago was. Lost my cursor. I believe it's right there, right beside Blue Lake 1. And that adit, of course, was driven into the identified ore body at the time. And as I said earlier, it's a collection of pods. All of these stylized cursive entities with names beside them, that constitutes the 5 million historical tonnage of 2.2%. These two square boxes are the only claims in the region that we don't own. And thankfully, as we look at what's in them from our gravity results, I'm happy not to own them. There's nothing particularly in there. Oops. So down in the bottom left corner, we have the tonnage for each of those pods. And what this and the next two graphs are going to show is that there is a lot of unexplained mass underneath and beside the known historical tonnage. And as we already told you, or I already told you, this rock that we're looking for is heavier than everything around it. So the unexplained tonnage, tantalizingly, could become more mineralization, more 2% copper, and maybe so much so that it's way greater than the amount we already know about. And that's probably going to take up most of 2025 and 2026 for our exploration plan. I'll point out the most tantalizing one so far from what we've seen in our studies of these gravity results. This Pogo deposit right over here. You can see all the old drill holes, and you can see that they're encompassed within this blue amoeba shape. But you can also see there's all this around it, and these are not drill holes, these are magnetic response lines. There's all this around it that's never been drilled. And then up over here, there's an entire area, which, again, continues down here, where you've got high gravimetric responses. And the star means that we picked up, I think that's probably a 1% copper piece of rock, just walking around on it on May 2024. So there's a lot of fantastic drill targets to be done here. So that's ahead of us. This is the same map with a different interpretation of the gravity data. So what we've done is we've now, rather than taking the holistic gravity result, we've now sliced and diced it, and we're looking only at extra mass, which we hope is mineralization, at a level which is 25 meters or 70 feet, if you want to think of it that way, below the current surface of the land. And still, we see this Pogo is really exciting. There's the historical tonnage outline, and you can see that it's over top of two, this one below and this one above, gravity anomalies the one above has never been drilled. So we want to drill that up over here again, all the way down here. And I'll note that from the software and the derivative math that goes into all this, we continue to see excess mass all the way down to the 500 meter level that we did as a limit of the gravity result, the gravity survey. Okay. This is the third time we're going to show you this data. In this situation, we've taken the gravity result, we've combined it with the already possessed electromagnetic response. I talked before about a high and a low. The red is the high response magnetic. The shaded red is the low response magnetic. And what you can see here is you've got a gravity response essentially overlaying or right beside the magnetic response. And I told you before that the rocks are heavier, they're magnetic, and those are two of the key things we're going to be looking for. And then in order to get you oriented, we've again shown POGO. So there's the existing known POGO from 1987. And here is the gravity result. So we're pretty excited about what we might find. Okay. And then again, all the way along here. And then finally, as a reminder, this is only the Blue Lake zone. We have 5 zones. So we have a lot to cover over the next few years. Let's talk about our next zone, the Cancun zone. The Cancun zone has its name because the original first name for it was the Miguel zone, but that didn't fit the alphabeticals. And also it was named Miguel because the geologist in training who was there first and took these samples and showed us what it's got. His name was Miguel. He's a young man, very wise, didn't want to have it named after himself because if he's in his 20s now, what's he got left to look forward to? So he suggested that we call it Cancun because it's in the southern end of our claims. And as far as geology is concerned, this place is a happening party. Everyone wants to be there, just like the Cancun in Mexico. So that's his name. All right. Well, what is it? It's a huge. It's 9 kilometers long at the moment. Probably grows. It's a huge 9 kilometer long U shape represented in the black line on this chart. All those little yellow dots are electromagnetic anomalies that were identified by aircraft flying over in the years 2011, 2010, 2009. And those were flown by a giant company called Anglo American. They used to own these claims, and then they dropped it when copper and nickel prices fell in 2012, 2013. So it came to us. We have all their data. We have all the claims now. And we're really excited about this because Anglo American never followed up on these yellow dots. We did, and we found the surface indications. Okay, here's the same chart of the Cancun zone, represented slightly differently. This is circles for where we've picked up rocks and sent them to the lab in the work that we did in September 2024. What was the black line, the U shape on the prior chart, is now a red line. And you can see the conductors again, all the way through. You can also see that our best showing of picking up a rock and sending it to the lab is actually not even on the U shape. So that gives us a tantalizing possibility that when we get subsurface, this might actually close up. It might be a giant ovoid, who knows? But it's a lot of work to be done to find out. And again, remember, this is material that's been on surface. So we want to know what is the fresher rock, the undisturbed rock underneath. Especially we want to know what grade is it. And I've been talking a lot about copper nickel, but interestingly, we didn't expect it, but we found just about 2 grams per ton gold in one of the samples that we picked up. There are other gold showings on our land. We'll have to now spend some time thinking about how that gold showing correlates or interprets into what we think we know already about the copper nickel system that was created here. There you go. So as I reminded everyone, we only got there at the end of the field work in 2024, and it'll be a priority for us in 2025. These are it's a chart of all the rock we chipped off in the Cancun zone, and it's ranked by copper equivalent. So you can see copper equivalent is 1% at the top of the chart, 0.24 at the bottom. What kind of grade do we need to have here? Look, if it's giant, 0.24, 0.4, all of that would be great. But what we're hoping to find is that it's 2 and change underneath. We'll get to why we expect that later on. But that comes up with the word weathering. Okay. This is an image of that, it's a camera shot of that sampling being done. And I include this in our slide because most people assume that what we have found is 100, 200, 300 meters deep. It's not. It's 1 foot deep, and it's a hilltop. All of that U shape that I've shown you in the last 3 slides is a huge hilltop. It's probably harder than the rock around it, which is why it remains a hilltop, as everything's been glaciated else away. And the trench we dug to take those samples, it's 1 foot, 2 foot deep. It's 40 foot wide. We found this mineralization using something called a beep mat. Geologists will know what that is, but regular investors like myself, I'll give you the 2-second version. It's a ski that you pull behind you, and it has a transducer that sends energy down about 15 feet. And when that energy hits something that's conductive, conducts electricity, or magnetic, the response back up from the rock that you're sliding over gets distorted. And that distortion is picked up by an operator's console, and it beeps, which is why it's called the beep mat. And so we use this beep map to identify continuous mineralization across that 9 kilometers. Plus, we've been doing trenching and sampling along the 9 kilometers. And one of the things to keep in mind when you ask yourself, how big is it going to be? We don't know yet, but the depth range of that beep map is only about 15 feet. And it may well be that this 9 kilometers is a portion of something much larger or even a little bit larger. But the beep map just doesn't go, the amount of dirt over the copper nickel is greater than 15 feet, and so it loses its signal. So we don't know yet whether that 9 kilometer terminus point is because there's no more copper nickel or because we just can't catch it with the beep map. So that's, again, something we want to do a lot of work on in 2025. There it is. It's a 1.5 foot hole, and the soil that's built up since glaciation is very light. You can see that with the mosses and the ferns around. And so it's up on a hill. There's no overburden. We're really excited about this. We're going to move to another zone, the Anticline Lake Zone. This is, it's almost another U shape, except it's got a secondary U inverted into it. And again, all these U shapes are because of that continental collision I told you about at the beginning. Everything is crushing into itself, right? On one hand, you have the core of North America. And on the other hand, you have what is now Labrador and it was originally the coast of North America, smashing into each other and bending and folding, creating a lot of heat, moving all these metals and minerals around. And then eventually it cooled. And those cooling patterns, of course, look like that folded hot molten metal, which it was back almost 2 billion years ago. So if you think of Cancun as a U shape like this, well, the Anticline zone is almost a U shape the other way with this indentation in it. And so this is what we've got here. Again, it's a huge zone. There's all kinds of showings of copper nickel. And we haven't done any gravity work here. We're probably going to spend a lot more time in the field up here in 2025. It's not as advanced as other Cancun. Well, it's not an obvious ore body yet, like Cancun, and it's certainly not as advanced as the historical deposits at Blue Lake. But we're very optimistic about what this could become over the next couple of years. And again, Those are the rocks we've chipped off from 0.5% to 1%. And we expect that the grade beneath surface is even better. How much do we have and what is it going to become? That's really the question, the key question for investors here, including ourselves. So again, I'm highlighting what we already have. These are the known deposits in those little pods. They come to 4.8 million short tons. I'm rounding that to 5. Keep that in mind that this is pre-43-101. This was done in 1987. The observation from the people who did the math back then, not delimited in the right-hand column, means it's open at depth or open on the sides. They don't think they were exhaustive in their work. And as a matter of fact, their definition of what should be included in this math is when the mass of sulfide that hosts the copper nickel is less than 5 feet wide, they stopped counting. Now, with today's methods, you can do a lot better than that. Okay. So this slide, this is actually taken from one of our recent press releases. And as we've been consolidating all the data, plus we're in Quebec, which in my opinion is the best exploration and mining jurisdiction in the world, a lot of or almost all the historical data is available online, not only to us, but to the public. And we've gone back and made a habit of looking at the drill holes from the 1980s. And in at least one case, we have found where a 1980s drill hole has hit into one of our identified gravimetric anomalies from the survey of 2024. When we go back and look at that hole, we see that at a corresponding depth, it hits 2.2% copper equivalent for 4 feet. We think that's super exciting because it validates this gravimetric work we've been doing and opens a tantalizing possibility for what all this gravity mass is going to be once we get to drill it all up. So 2025, what are we going to do? We're going to do more field work. We're probably going to add to the claims. So in the Anticline Lake Zone, the Blue Lake Zone, and the Cancun Zone, zones A, B, and C, wherever we see the not triangulation, but quadrangulation of magnetics, gravity, conductivity, and then sampling on the top where we found rock, we're going to start to drill. And one of the things we're going to be doing is also checking in the Cancun Zone to find unweathered fresh rock beneath the samples. So we'll be doing a lot of probably shallow drilling in Cancun to prove that it's 2 or whatever it's going to be underneath. And then once we've got that settled, then we go deep. So we'll do a bunch of short holes and then do deep holes. We're going to do a lot more gravity. Hopefully we can get some of that done while the lakes are frozen. And we are applying we started the process of applying for a USA listing so that more people than just Canadians can have an easy time owning our stock. We're going to be consulting with global geology complex structure experts to help us understand that collision from 2 billion years ago. There are other examples in geology of that. There are some in Australia. The Kambalda, I believe it is, Kambaldi mine in Western Australia. It looks like it's the same kind of collision. Raglan looks like it's the same kind of collision. And so understanding how those collisions work and how that magma moves sideways through the land or even on top of the land when it comes out to surface will help us understand where to look even better. So we'll be doing a lot of that in 2025, and we're going to be drilling. It's never too early to think about the mining model. As I said at the beginning, no one wants to find a great resource that's 1,000 kilometers from anywhere. As I said at the beginning, there's been open pit mining since the 1950s. It's already great infrastructure. There is I'll use the word stranded, but that's a shortener. There is a stranded hydroelectric dam. So 70 kilometers from the Cancun Zone is a hydroelectric dam that was built with 4 turbine slots. It's only got 3 turbines in it, and it has no customers. So we're hoping that as we prove up what we've got and we prove up that electricity will be needed, there's a deal to be done to get cheap power. And as experienced investors know, cheap power makes a huge difference for the economics of a mining operation. If you want to know more about us, all the public spaces, right? The historical database of Quebec, the current database of Quebec. We have a chat at ceo.ca that people are interested in. Should be ceo.ca/CUPI. We have YouTube videos that I've taken. Those are up on our channel. There's 6, right? They're doing videos for us with us all the time. CDAR, our own website, which is going to change over probably, well, maybe it'll be this month, maybe it'll be next, to CupaniMetals.com. But for now, all the information's up at Capital Light. And if you want to call me, there's my phone number, 416-844-5712. We don't have a lot of layers of employees. If you want to call me, call me. This is more about how do we go forward. That's what we're looking for. And I'll probably now turn it back to Romeo for questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Brian. I appreciate that presentation. Like I said, I got a couple of questions for you. I'm going to keep them pretty short just so we can get to all the great audience questions that are already in the chat. So to jump off, I know the gravity survey revealed 2 strong localized gravity highs at the northwest ends of the bands, with the Pogo deposit only occupying the southwestern portion of one anomaly. So I'm curious, what's your timeline for investigating that undrilled northwestern portion of the circular anomaly?
Yeah, I want to get it done this year. I actually want to get it done this winter if I can, but we need to do a little more refining of the geological model. The stuff we showed you is standard UBC model, University of British Columbia algorithm for interpreting gravity results. But because work's been done here since the 1980s for a bit, and then it stopped, and because we have all the samples of rock, we can already go back to that algorithm and tell it the mass per volume, or the weight per volume, therefore the mass of the target rock we're looking for is 4.6 as a density compared to water, which is 1.0. And the surrounding rock is 2.8. And so if you put those factors in and rerun the model, which takes weeks to do, you're going to get an even tighter response, which will give us even tighter of a drill target. But we want to be drilling that, if not the late winter, then as soon as we can. And of course, late winter is a good thing. I myself and part of our geo team, we're committed. We're going out to Shefferville. For those of you who don't know, Shefferville's cold in the winter. We're going out to Shefferville February 1st. We're going to do an exploratory expedition out to Cancun and to the Anticline and to the Blue Lake. It'll be sleds. Once we prove it's safe enough for sleds, we'll bring out trucks. If we get to the point where we can prove it's safe enough for trucks, we'll bring out probably an excavator or a bulldozer and use that to drag the drill set from one hole to another. And if we can't prove that up, or we're not sure that the ice will hold for another 2 months, we'll have helicopter support as well. But we'll be out there. I'll be out there freezing my tuckus starting February 1st. We figured the first expedition, exploratory, is probably going to run 2 weeks. And at the same time, as part of the drill permit application in Quebec, which we fully support the new rules that came in May 2023, you need to go make presentations to the First Nations and the local communities. So we're hoping to do all that while we're up there. We have a great relationship with them so far. Get the permits in, start drilling right away. We've been talking with drilling contractors. We're getting quotes. We're moving forward. Awesome. I've already forgotten what your question was. Did I answer it? And if so, let's move on. If not, give it to me again.
No, you got to it. I think that's great. You're headed to a much colder Cancun than most Canadians are in February, so good for you. One thing I got, there's an interesting discrepancy noted between surface sample grades and historical bulk sample material, which you attributed today to weathering. But I'm curious if you could elaborate on how the 2001 Berry Lake study just generally informs your understanding of this grade variation, particularly for nickel, but overall.
Sure. So you know what? I should probably say that Berry Lake, let me see if I've got an example of Berry Lake in our maps here that I can show everybody. I'm just looking through the deck myself super quick. Okay. If you don't mind, I'm going to share for just a second.
Yeah, no, go for it.
So I hope everyone can see this. Berry Lake is this collection of showings right here inside what we call the Blue Lake Zone, but probably 15 kilometers away from the historical tonnage. Okay. So Berry Lake has, interestingly, it's also where there's another find of 2 grams per ton gold. Just like in Cancun, it seems to be similar process. We'll leave that aside for a sec. There's copper nickel. People did sampling in the 90s and the 80s, and they got a result that was nice. But somebody went back in 2000 and did something called channel sampling. So they brought a saw and they cut, call it 1 foot wide, 1 foot deep into the rock and went for 18 feet. And then they took that rock that was not at surface, maybe it was 3 feet deep, doesn't really matter. And then they sent the rock that was not at surface to the lab and had it tested for metals content alongside the surface rock. So the surface rock was half as much nickel as the deeper rock. And that, if you think about it, for where we are in the world, and for all the maps I showed you with sediment having copper nickel in the water, this all makes sense. The continental collision from 2 billion years ago, let's assume for a moment, it created this vast complex system of 2% copper equivalent, copper and nickel together. But wherever that rock came to surface, it has now dealt with millions of years, or almost billions of years, of repeated glaciation. So glaciers, a couple miles thick, would come over here and scrub everything. And then now they've retreated 10,000 years ago, most recently, creating the ability for water to wash everything down into the lakes and the rivers, which breaks up the rock, taking the mineralization with it. And so everywhere we are, we see, and Blue Lake's a great example, there's 2.2% underneath the surface. And if you pick up a rock right above it, you get 1 or 0.5%. And that's because the rocks on surface are already broken up and their mineralization is washing away. Okay. So Berry Lake, somebody did that and then wrote a geotechnical report about it. It's online for everyone to read. And that is further confirmation that this idea makes sense. And holistically, between the history of glaciation, the sediments with metals in it, and the fact that Blue Lake is a higher grade underground than it does at surface, all of it makes sense for us. And that's why it's the important next step for Cancun.
Awesome. No, appreciate that. That's great. One question I've got, while we're on just the land package generally, with the property now encompassing like 1,010 claims, if I'm not mistaken, over almost 500 square kilometers, and this gravity survey is focused on the Blue Lake Zone. I'm curious what criteria you and Douglas and the team have to prioritize which areas of the larger land package will get this type of really detailed geophysical surveying next.
So I'll begin with, we haven't spoken about Douglas yet. We're talking about Douglas McQuarrie. It's probably a good time to mention Douglas owns 20% of the company. I own 30% of the company. We have other directors that own between them a few percent. So there's more than 50% of the shares are owned by the insiders. It's a very tight share structure, and we got our shares by buying them in financings and buying them in the market. So start there. Douglas is a great leader for us because he is a geologist who has been exploring and finding things since the 1970s. His last company, he built from nothing over a decade. It's now, he's left it. It's now operating 3 gold mines in Ghana. It's called Asante Gold. Its market cap is $500 million. So he's a guy who knows how to find something, knows how to build something. The short answer for me is we send the teams where Douglas tells us to send the teams. I'm a finance guy. The longer answer is there is, think of it as a rolling wave of, we're going to do field work first everywhere it hasn't been done. Then when we find a showing that's interesting, or we can map something with a beat map that's interesting, then we will look at what is in the historical record for magnetics data. Maybe we'll run some magnetics ourselves. Maybe we'll find some historical data. Maybe we'll do a gravity ourselves, or maybe we'll do the magnetics first, right? You always want to make sure that this next step you're taking is a good risk reward step for the money you're spending, which of course comes back to, since we're the insiders and we own the shares, and we're spending the money, we don't want to spend badly because we'd be diluting ourselves. There's a very, very good shareholder alignment here, management to the outside shareholders, because we want to see great return on the investment in the field.
That makes sense. Now, there are a number of questions that came in over email during this event. So I'm going to give you a couple rapid fire just so we can get through them and then jump into the questions that are in the chat. So the first one is, are there plans to bring vehicle saws out this winter to assist with channel samples?
Vehicle saws. Debate happening right now within the company. If you think about Cancun as 9 kilometers, and I assume the question is really about Cancun.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Let's say you bring in a excavator and you have a rock hammer on it, and you're going to make a trench. So you clear the soil, you make a trench pneumatically, and you get to a situation where you've gone down to the bottom of what the excavator can do, call it 10 feet, 18 feet, whatever. But because it's a hilltop, the weathering is actually maybe down to 30 feet or 40 feet. We don't know that. So that's kind of a risk that we think, instead of trenching, it's probably smarter to do shallow drilling, right? So if you drill down to 40 or 50 feet, you'll clearly see where that change, that delineation from weathered to unweathered is happening. And you'll have the core sampling to send off to the lab. And then you'll hopefully also see the folding in the rock, which will help you point to where you want to drill next. So the current conversation in the company is that we'll do a lot of shallow drilling, both straight down on top of that U in the Cancun zone, and then occasionally from the side going through it underneath, and then making an, sorry, I should raise my fingers up, making an X pattern to try and hit on both sides, and then find everything we can learn from it, right? Because if you had done channel sampling or trenching, your next step would have been drilling anyway. So we think, and this is a conversation we're having, we think that's the next right move. And so that's why we're talking with drilling contractors, and we're saying to them, this is all a bunch of shallow holes. It's non-standard. We'll do the deeper holes once we finish the shallow holes at Cancun, and then we'll take the whole kit and caboodle over to Blue Lake and do deeper holes on Pogo. But that's the conversation at the moment.
No, appreciate the insight into internal conversation. I think that's great. In the same vein of questions, somebody asked, and this actually covers one in the chat as well. So when thinking of a drill program, how many meters do you envision for phase 1?
Okay, so let's define what phase 1 would be. So let's assume for a moment we're going to do Cancun is 9 kilometers. So what's the interval you need along that 9 kilometers to put a hole down to be sure that you can interpret as constant your results? So let's say that's 40 holes along 9 kilometers. And then you're only going to go, we presume 50, right? So there's 2,000. But then as soon as you start to go deeper, you're going to want to go maybe down to 500 at Pogo. You don't really know. So I would say the current conversation for phase 1, and I'll also point out that it's currently our plan to leave the drill there. We're not going to demobilize it. Leave the drill there and continually use it all the way through. So let's say phase 1 is 5,000 and then followed by 5,000 for phase 2. And then you just keep going until you learn everything.
Great. No, appreciate that. TB in the chat asks, are you eligible for the Quebec exploration refunds, and how much of exploration will they cover in 2025?
The refunds. Love these refunds. I've told you before, I said Quebec's the best jurisdiction. So last year we raised $2 million. We already had about $1.5 million in the bank left over from our financing days, our financial operations days. And Douglas bought half of that $2 million. Douglas is a resident of British Columbia, so he bought flow through, which allowed us to spend the money in Quebec. And then, as I understand it, because he's not a resident of Quebec, Revenue Quebec, yes, will allow a refund. And because we're in northern Quebec and we're doing it for copper nickel, I believe that refund can reach as high as 38 cents of every dollar we spent. The process for that is we file our taxes and then present our receipts and then ask for the refund back. And then the Quebec government adjudicates, yes, that was a valid expense. This one's not. Here's the rate we're going to give you. So absolutely. And we're looking forward to a check from them April or May of 2025.
Gotta love Quebec. Now, just as we're towards the end of the hour, I always like to conclude with, I think we captured a lot of the questions in the chat and over email. I'm curious what you think investors should be most excited about for Cupani in the coming year, and what are you personally looking most forward to?
Look, I told you we've got great drill targets. I want to drill them. I want to see what those are. Because if you think about the valuation today, 20 million bucks Canadian, half of it owned by the insiders, like that's nothing. If we even double Pogo, we're going to go up. If it turns out that all of those gravimetrics, or even half of them, are something, we're going to go way up. Cancun turns out to be 2% and large. That's a company maker by itself. So, as I said at the beginning, we've got a huge mouthful of opportunity for a company of our size. And sometimes I lie awake at night wishing I had a crystal ball to see how it's going to turn out. But I'm old enough to know that I should probably stop and enjoy the journey as we go. But yeah, I want to get these drilled. We either want to drill it and rejoice, or drill it to kill it and move on to the rest of the zones.